everyone, this is James with 802 Garden Gurus. Today I will be discussing with you the benefits we experienced with our first wood chip back to Eden garden, quote unquote, and some of the challenges we had to overcome in our first year of gardening with wood chips. The first challenge we had to overcome was the fact that we laid the wood chips down in the spring instead of in the fall, which doesn't allow the wood chips to assimilate into the soil in the biology as it would during wintertime. So that was our first challenge. We dug troughs to plant in the fertile soil below the wood chips. We raised all our seedlings inside in seedling trays under lights, and as the spring came around, we began digging troughs out of the wood chips we laid over our garden area, which was about 20 yards of bedding material we got from a local sawmill, which was very fine. It was about 90% hemlock and 10% pine. So the first thing we did, as you can see here, is we started spinach and arugula and other cold weather greens inside our greenhouse during March, and then covered it with wood chips. So we planted directly in the soil and then added the wood chips on top and watered adequately, and we had great results with that. As you can see, the greens in the greenhouse did just fine, even with watering the wood chips in. But keep in mind, the wood chips were only on top of the soil. We took great care not mixing the wood chips in with the soil to begin with, and so we had good results from that, as you can see here. So as our seedlings were growing inside under lights and outside when the conditions were right, we worked profusely at digging trenches in the freshly laid wood chips to expose the soil below, in which we would plant our seedlings. And as the weather grew warmer and warmer, we eventually moved our greenhouse to a lot out behind our primary garden. As you can see here, the greenhouse has been moved. We're digging trenches for what will be the beds for our seedlings, and also building trellises with what we have, sticks and branches and anything else. It was a challenge not mixing the wood chips into the soil below, which we were very concerned about, and we wanted to make sure we didn't. And as you can see here in the next slide, the greens in the beds that were covered in the greenhouse did very well. The soil below our wood chips is very fertile, as it has been pasture land for decades and farmland below that. And so we had great results with our early greens, our early season vegetables, cold weather greens, etc., etc. The wood chips are excellent for retaining moisture in the soil. When you layer them on top of the fertile soil, they act as an insulator, making it more difficult for water to escape. And one thing we noticed about the wood chips was the ability for the soil underneath to retain moisture and for it not to get wicked away just from exposure to the outside wind and the sunlight, obviously, and the process of evaporation. So the wood chips, and especially the fine bedding material we used from the local sawmill up the road, would become densely packed and act as a great barrier to offset the process of evaporation and retain moisture as much as possible. That was one of our primary goals, because we don't have access to a spigot. We only use rain barrels, so we need to retain as much water as possible and protect the soil as much as possible with the wood chip covering. And it does a great job. Most importantly, is making sure that the seedlings have enough nutrients and the wood chips don't leach nutrients out of the soil, causing deficiencies in the plants, which was a challenge I'll talk about more as we progress in our photo montage here. But you can see we're slowly digging beds in the wood chips to expose the fertile soil below and planting our seedlings in the ground below, which worked out great. It was a little difficult bending over excessively into troughs, but it worked well for our first year season, seeing how we had just moved into this into an apartment which had this property available for us to garden, which was a big priority. And you can see the arugula, the mesclun mix, and the kale that we planted in the greenhouse beds is doing exceptionally well into early spring. And we never went without greens all year. We never bought greens all season. So we very, very happy with that result. In the next photo, you will notice us building our single stem method for growing tomatoes, and with the same process we dug trenches, and we even bought compost from a local farmer down the road and used the compost to fill in the trough even more to plant our tomato seedlings. And to even make sure we offset any nutrient loss from the freshly laid wood chips, we used bat guano, which was an amazing compost additive soil amendment that produced great results for our seedlings, and we were very happy with how they grew. But we did have many worries and concerns about the wood chips creating such imbalances in the soil and ultimately being detrimental to our crop, our production. But for the first year and for what we had to work with, it worked out very well. And this is the first year we've gardened on this scale, and we are really really driven towards biodynamic, sustainable permaculture gardening. Just mimicking nature to the best of our ability. And as you can see, the garden was coming along very well, and we continued to harvest early season greens and vegetables from our garden, as well as tons of other wild edibles that grew in our local area. That lot of dandelion, tons of dandelion, raspberries, strawberries, and stuff like that. And so we slowly sculpted our garden on a whim, pretty much. We really hadn't too much of a plan. We weren't familiar with the sun and how it would come over the garden throughout the year, so it was really just a guessing game and a race against time, seeing how we had just moved into this area on February 1st. And we laid the wood chips down at the end of February, early March. And by early April to mid-April into May, we were already producing a lot of greens, and our seedlings were doing pretty well. And it continued to do well into mid-spring. Here you can see our tomato seedling, our Brandywine tomatoes. Also there's some cherry tomatoes in there too. They got mixed, unfortunately, so it was no big deal. And the single stem method really helped us a lot. Talk more about that. But we began to have problems with insects such as cucumber beetles and imported cabbage worm moths. So we used Agribon to protect our plants, and here we used Agribon to protect them, the tomatoes, from a very dramatic cold spell that came in mid-spring after we had exceptionally warm early spring temperatures. So the Agribon played a great part in not only protecting our plants from the weather and the wind, which we see a lot of wind in our area, but also from the infestation of flying insects, which really took a toll on our garden and was probably the greatest challenge we had this year, or in 2016 with the Back to Eden garden. But other than that, we continued to push forward, sculpting the once property that was just grass and transforming it into our permaculture Back to Eden garden. And we used also coarse mulch, which I had bought from a local tree trimming company to mulch around our tomato plants and all our other seedlings. So the mulching was a huge benefit for us, as it suppressed the once grass that was underneath and turned that back into soil, and much of the weeds, except for burdock and yellow dock, which is just a powerful plant that can come up through the soil no matter what. Burdock and yellow dock and sunchokes, which were a struggle to keep up with. But other than that, many other native grasses and plants that would have grown up otherwise were definitely killed and suppressed, and made gardening in this area much easier. And so our tomato seedlings grew very nicely up their single stems, as you can see here. Also, we tried to keep our garden as permaculture as possible and pollinator friendly, and we grew medicinal herbs. As you can see here, there's some calendula, there's sunflowers, and we tried to keep a natural look to our garden as possible, and with a mixture of, straight line farming techniques, but everything is organic, non-GMO. It's all just working with what we have, and this happy little calendula flower. So yeah, here's the same bed against the rock wall parallel to the road, and beyond that rock wall is wild grapes, raspberry bushes, there's sumac, and tons of other good native wild edibles. So we try to keep in harmony with all that and grow with that. Here's some our bed of pepper plants, which was not as successful as we would liked it to, but nevertheless they seemed to grow really well, and they enjoyed the mulching. We probably planted them a little too late, and so our fruit didn't develop as much as we wanted to, and then we had some shading issues with a large maple tree. But all in all, it was a great experience. for the first year. And here you can see some circular cabbage beds we made. The farthest round bed would eventually have a vertical trellis built on it, a pyramid trellis that we grew cantaloupe with much success on. We also installed, this is just in a few short weeks, mind you, working hard and diligently, we acquired some Ozark strawberry plants from a relative of mine, and we sculpted out a strawberry patch as quick as we could, and transformed, shoveled the land around and just transformed the once front yard of this property we're renting on into our permaculture / back to Eden garden. And they seem to love the wood chips. That's what I want to emphasize most, is wood chips. The mulching is just great for the fungal activity. So much mycorrhizal under these wood chips as the season went on. You could just see it spreading like crazy. In the soil underneath, the wood chips was just so soft and spongy, like chocolate cake. Earthworms everywhere, tons of earthworms. Here's me, late spring. You can see early summer. Garden is flourishing. The wood chip is a great material for keeping grass suppressed, and our plants did exceptionally well. The kale grew, and many other greens. Unfortunately, our bed of broccoli, which you see here, broccoli and cauliflower, was not doing well. It did not like the shade that was being cast by the large maple tree, which we were unaware of in the beginning of this process. And also we have a microbe that causes the cauliflower and cabbage not to produce heads, or cauliflower and broccoli not to produce heads. Here you can see the kale under the protection of the agribon, since the imported cabbage moth was a real problem. Little white butterflies with black spots on their wings love to lay eggs all over this stuff, and they just multiply like you can't imagine. So agribon is great for protecting your brassica plants from imported cabbage moth. As the season grew on and the kale got stronger, the agribon came off, and we switched to diatomaceous earth for a strategy for insect deterring and keeping our plants healthy and vital as possible. Oh yeah, it was a great time. The tomato plants did very well for what they were, for just being planted in the soil that's been covered with wood chips. We made sure to put bat guano to them very copiously, and the single stem method really helped their vitality, and we had very little disease, very little blight on our tomato plants, and they grew well into the summer. They produced flowers very early. You can see they're not that big, and they have a lot of flowers on them. We removed as many suckers as possible, and did as much pruning as possible to keep them growing and putting their energy into fruit. And they flowered tremendously and produced some nice tomatoes that we were able to put in the freezer, 5 or 6 gallon bags full. Here you can see the amount of tomatoes ripening into mid-summer, late summer on the tomato trellis, the single stem method. We also tried some companion planting with basil underneath there. Try to work with nature as best as possible. This is California poppy that Katie, my partner, planted in the herb garden section. And they were very happy. We moved our greenhouse to the back side of the garden into the field behind our garden, where we would continue to grow seedlings in the early spring, late summer, and we were also transforming that area, which was overgrown pasture land with a fallen tree and all sorts of debris, to use and cultivate. And so we did all this simultaneously, working our butts off while working our full-time jobs. You can see just after moving the greenhouse, this is what it looked like before we cleaned all this up. Fallen trees, debris, giant mud hole right next to the greenhouse, just overgrown with years of wild native plants, that never been hayed, because that corner of the field was just, there was no reason to hay it, so it just overgrew. But we came in there and started cleaning it up nicely. You can see slowly we trimmed everything up, and at the same time we stacked all the debris along the rock wall next to the road, with the intention of using the composting wood material as a foundation for a fungal garden, which we were going to plant as well, mushrooms. And I had bought some King Stropharia spawn, and we had inoculated our Back to Eden garden with some wine cap spawn, which loves to create symbiotic relationship with plants and break down wood chips into the soil, which we ultimately realized would be highly beneficial. And we can do that naturally with the material that's available. So we moved all this wood and created this nice little area, as you can see here, where we would plant mini honey butternut squash as well as butternut squash, and we planted spaghetti squash out here. So we were able to, for the first year, hustling our bottoms off, we were able to use a lot of the land and transform it into a productive environment. At the same time, here's the pile of wood we created a hugelkultur pile, and with the intention of inoculating, we inoculated all this wood with King Stropharia spawn, which we hope to see this year in 2017 some fruit of the fungal ecosystems that we encouraged the growth of. So after all the cleanup was done, this is kind of what it looked like. It began as spring turned into summer. Things just bolted, and keeping up with the native plants that grow there so well was a challenge in itself, as well as all the cucumber beetles and many other insects which ravaged our garden. But we didn't give up, and we continued to see results from our garden. And so we had to protect seedlings as much as possible with things like diatomaceous earth, and we used neem oil. Here's some honey butternut squash and some spaghetti squash we planted. And you can see they're doing okay for where they are. And they turned out to do very well and produce a good amount of fruit for us into the fall. Another week or so later, you can see the squash plants that we dug holes in the ground, planted the seedlings with compost and bat guano into the pasture land, and then mulched around it with our wood chips, which ultimately, in the end, helped the plants immensely. And they were very happy. Aside from all the cucumber beetles, which love to reproduce in this pasture that we turned into our small garden. And we quickly realized, because we live on a farm, that our garden was kind of the crop trap, and it was a challenge to protect our seedlings. So once all our seedlings grew in the greenhouse, in the field, and we had them in the ground, we decided we were going to do a vertical trellis of melon plants, particularly Moon and Stars watermelon and Hale's Best melons, which we had intended to grow up the frame of our greenhouse once we removed the cover as a vertical greenhouse trellis. Unfortunately, most of the melon plants planted outside the greenhouse before the cover came off were destroyed by cucumber beetles and whatever else is out there, squash bugs that were just, they decimated the plants. We spread 10 pounds of diatomaceous earth all over the place whenever we had to, and it still was a challenge. The melons on the inside, as you see here, did much better than the melons planted outside, and so we began to train them up the trellis of the greenhouse into a trellis. We stringed the greenhouse trellis, and using our handy dandy plant clamps we bought off eBay, we clamped all these Moon and Stars watermelon plants up the greenhouse to arch all the way around the outside, which obviously exposes the majority of the plant's surface area to the sun, creating better productivity. As we took the greenhouse cover off, exposing the plants to the outdoors, we had to copiously spread diatomaceous earth routinely on the watermelon plants to keep squash bugs and cucumber beetles away from them, because it was just a challenge. They loved reproducing in these plants. And as you can see here, the Moon and Stars melons are making their way up the trellis slowly, and they began to grow happily and vitally. We think we might have got them in the ground a little too late, so next year we'll get them in the ground earlier. We also pruned these plants in a single stem fashion to move energy into growing main vines and flowers and ultimately fruit. And you can see some diatomaceous earth on the lower leaves of these plants. And slowly and surely we began to see fruit. And there's the moon, and you see a couple stars on that one. That's the Moon and Stars melon, a very small one, and the very handy and highly recommended gardening clips we found on eBay. Very cheap. Obviously they come from China, so you can get very many of them for a very, just a couple dollars, $10, $20. And we slowly began to see fruit growing larger and larger. We ultimately had to use penny hose to secure them from breaking the vine and just tumbling to the ground because they became so heavy. And we had some nice melons, which provided fruit for us, and they were delicious. And we got seeds, more importantly, for next year. The whole garden is non-GMO, open pollinated garden. All our seeds come from High Mowing Seeds in Vermont, and this is our vertical trellis for our cantaloupes. These are Hale's Best melons, and so getting the vines off the ground and exposing the majority of the plant's surface area to the most amount of sun it can receive is a huge benefit for the plant, and they really were happy. And it was much easier to control disease and rot or any other infestations that were trying to take hold. They had better airflow, and we had about 5 to 8 nice sweet and tasty cantaloupes, as you can see one here. We also grew many other things, but most of all our brassicas seem to be ravaged most by imported cabbage moth, and the cucumber beetles killed all our cucumbers, and those plants, cucurbits and brassicas, took the hit the most. But here is some cabbages we grew in the kind of permaculture bed next to the rock wall, adjacent, parallel to the road. We got many cabbages. Ultimately, they had to just outgrow the infestation of cabbage worms, but they seemed to grow just fine, and we got some nice healthy cabbages out of it. The kale did exceptionally. Leaf vegetables did amazing, and the wood chips just in a few short months turned to dirt. And we are very happy with the Back to Eden method, the wood chip method of gardening, and we will continue to use wood chips in our garden in Fletcher, Vermont here. And as we expand, we'll only emphasize those strategies more and more and use them to our advantage. And for the first year of our Back to Eden garden / permaculture garden, we saw tremendous results in the retention of water more so than anything. I gotta imagine hundreds of gallons of water was stored in these wood chips, as some areas in the garden were maybe 5 to 8 inches thick with wood chips. But the plants underneath, such as yellow dock and burdock, really just grew up through the wood chips amazingly, especially sunchokes. But ultimately, at the end of the year, we had a lot of fruit, and we were very happy with with 2016's Back to Eden garden, and we are looking forward to this year and growing our gardens even more. We have more area to work with this year, so we'll be using many permaculture methods: sheet mulching, wood chip mulching, whatever else we can use to mimic nature and produce healthy organic fruits and keep us sustained throughout the winter season. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching.